The dipper trembled in Ira Kellum's hand before he steadied it against the rim of the bucket, and for a moment he just stood there in the gray dawn light of his barn, looking at the thin brown liquid inside as if it might answer him back. It was March of 1936, on a stretch of hard red clay land outside Larkspur, Kansas, and Ira had exactly 110 pounds of seed, corn left to his name, the same bag he'd carried home from his father's cellar 4 winters ago, its kernels gone dull and wrinkled with age. Everyone in Ellsworth County believed the same thing that spring, that a man who wanted a crop worth harvesting bought fresh hybrid seed from Roscoe Sutter's store on Main Street, paid what Sutter asked, and thanked him for the privilege. Old seed was for men who couldn't afford to farm properly, or who didn't care to. Ira had heard that opinion recited to him so many times it had started to sound like scripture. He dipped 2 fingers into the bucket anyway. The dipper itself was nothing much to look at, a chipped tin cup with a wooden handle worn smooth and dark from his father's grip and now from his own, a tool so ordinary that nobody but Ira would have thought to keep it. His father had used it to measure lime for the chicken coop, to scoop feed, to bail water from a leaking rain barrel. Now Ira meant to use it for something else entirely, something he'd only heard whispered about from an old German farmer 2 counties over. Soak the seed corn in diluted cattle urine 10 hours before it ever touched the ground. He had gone to Sutter's Seed and Feed 3 days earlier, believing he still had a chance at hybrid seed on credit, the way he had the year before. The store smelled of new burlap and machine oil, and Roscoe Sutter stood behind the counter in a clean, white shirt that never seemed to gather a speck of the dust that covered everyone else in the county. Sutter didn't so much refuse Ira as make a show of considering it, and then setting the thought down like something distasteful. He said the bank had tightened up on him too, that a man with Ira's kind of debt already on the books was a poor risk for more, and that he had good hybrid stock reserved for growers who paid in full and paid on time. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was arithmetic delivered with a faint, satisfied smile, as if Ira's failure confirmed something Sutter had always privately believed about him. Ira didn't argue. He thanked Sutter for his time, which cost him something to do, and walked out past 3 farmers waiting their turn who wouldn't quite meet his eye. That night he pulled the old seed bag down from the shelf and turned the kernels over in his palm under the lantern, counting the shriveled ones, the ones with the faint blue-green bloom of mold at their tips. 45%, maybe less, would ever push a shoot through the soil, and even that was optimistic. He thought of what the German farmer, a quiet man named Klaus Ostergaard, had told him at a Grange supper 2 winters back, that manure and stale urine carried something in them, some hidden chemistry that could wake up old seed the way strong coffee wakes a tired man. Klaus had called it an old country trick, something his grandfather swore by on the Baltic coast, where good seed was too precious to waste and too expensive to throw away on faith alone. Ira hadn't thought much of it at the time. He thought of it now. He walked out to the barn, filled a clean bucket from the stock tank, and began, with the dipper his father had left him, to measure. He didn't tell his wife what he was doing, not that first night. And he didn't tell his neighbors at all. Some things a man has to be sure of himself before he can stand behind them, and Ira Kellum, watching his old seed sink slowly into that thin brown liquid, was not yet sure of anything except that he had no better choice left to try. The belief Ira had grown up inside, the one every farmer in Ellsworth County seemed to share that spring, held that progress moved in only one direction, forward toward the new, away from whatever a man's father had done before him. Hybrid seed had arrived in Kansas only a handful of years earlier, promising yields no open-pollinated variety could match, and Roscoe Sutter had built his whole standing in Larkspur around being the man who sold it. He'd come up from nothing himself, a hired hand's son who'd married into a little money and turned a single feed wagon into the biggest store on Main Street inside a decade, and there was something in him that needed every farmer in the county. To keep believing his way was the only sound way forward. A man who succeeded outside that system, with old seed, with a trick from the old country, with nothing bought on credit from Sutter's shelves, didn't just embarrass Sutter. He threatened the whole architecture the man had built his life upon, one loan and one sale at a time. The Saturday after Ira began his soaking, the Larkspur Grange held its spring meeting in the hall above the hardware store, the way it always did before planting season, and half the township turned out to hear the county extension man talk about seed selection. Roscoe Sutter sat near the front, as he always did, because he had bought the co-op's outstanding loan paper 2 winters earlier and now held more sway over who got credit than the bank in Ellsworth itself did. He was a tall man with pale, well-kept hands, and he had a way of leaning back in his chair that made the whole room feel like it belonged to him. When the extension man finished speaking, Sutter stood, unhurried, and said he'd heard something worth sharing with the room, that Ira Kellum, out on the old Pruitt place, had taken to soaking his corn in a bucket of cow piss like some backwoods root doctor. A ripple of laughter went through the hall, quick and ugly, the kind that dies fast but leaves a mark. Kenneth Quinlan, who ran the feed scale for the co-op and had weighed Ira's wagon 100 times, laughed along with the rest before he caught himself and looked a little ashamed toward the back row where Ira was sitting with his hat in his lap. Sutter wasn't finished. He said a man who couldn't afford proper seed had no business shaming honest hybrid growers by association, and that folks ought to think twice before extending further patience, or further credit, to a farmer who'd rather play alchemist than pay his debts like everyone else. He said this looking directly at Ira, smiling the whole time, the smile of a man certain he'd already won whatever this was. Selma Quimby, who sat 2 rows over with her husband and had known the Kellum family since before Ira was born, felt her face go hot on his behalf. Though she said nothing, nobody said anything. The room simply waited to see what a shamed man would do. Ira stood up slowly. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't defend the bucket in the barn, because there was nothing yet to defend, no proof, no crop, nothing but an old man's story from the Baltic coast, and a hope he wasn't ready to put into words for a room full of strangers. He said only that he supposed time would tell whose seed came up thicker come June, and that he'd be glad to let Mr. Sutter judge the fields himself when the corn was tall enough to see over a fence post. Then he put his hat back on and walked out, past Kenneth Quinlan's apologetic half-nod, past Selma Quimby's quiet, searching look, into the cold dark of the parking lot where his horse stood waiting. He didn't hurry home. He let the horse pick its own pace along the frozen ruts of the county road, and somewhere past the 2nd-mile marker he found himself almost smiling, not because the evening had gone well, it plainly hadn't, but because he understood something now that he hadn't understood walking into that hall. Sutter needed him to fail publicly. A quiet failure wouldn't have been worth mentioning from the front of a Grange meeting. That meant Sutter was already afraid of something, even if neither of them could yet say what. He told his wife, Nettie, that night, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low to save oil, and she listened without interrupting, the way she always did when a decision had already been made and only needed saying out loud. She asked him one question: what happened if it didn't work? If the bucket in the barn was nothing but an old man's superstition and they lost even the poor 45% they might have gotten from planting the seed dry? Ira didn't have a clever answer for her. He said that 45% of 110 pounds wouldn't feed them past October regardless, hybrid or not, urine or not, and that he'd rather fail trying something than fail waiting on Roscoe Sutter's mercy. Nettie nodded slowly, refilled his coffee, and didn't bring it up again. That was the whole of it. No speeches, no promises, just 2 people agreeing to walk toward the same uncertain thing together. What Ira didn't say to her, because he barely had words for it himself yet, was how much steadier he felt since walking out of that Grange hall. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles on a man once he stops needing a room full of strangers to believe him. He went about the following days differently than before, not defiant, not proud, just steady, the way a man is steady when he has stopped arguing with people who were never going to be persuaded and started working instead. He mended fence in the mornings. He hauled manure in the afternoons. He said little to the men he passed on the road, and when one of them, a younger farmer named Otis Pruitt, called out something about cow piss and corn, Ira only touched his hat brim and kept walking, and Otis, getting no reaction to feed on, found the joke wasn't much fun to tell twice. That contrast, small as it looked from the outside, was the whole shape of the thing. Sutter needed an audience to feel powerful. Ira needed only a bucket, a dipper, and 10 hours. Sutter's authority ran on other men's fear of him, on the credit ledger he kept locked in his desk drawer, on the particular silence that falls over a room when a man who can call in your note stands up to speak. Ira's authority, such as it was, ran on something slower and less visible, an old German farmer's memory of the Baltic coast, a chemistry neither of them could fully explain, and a willingness to be laughed at now in exchange for being right later. Neither man knew yet which kind of authority the summer would reward. But Ira, walking his fence line with wire pliers in his coat pocket, found he no longer much cared what the Grange Hall thought of him. He had a crop to grow, and for the first time in months that felt like enough. 10 gallons of water to 1 gallon of aged cattle urine, that was the ratio Klaus Ostergaard had given him, and Ira measured it out with the same tin dipper his father had used for lime and feed, filling and pouring, until the stock tank behind the barn held a mixture the color of weak tea. He'd let the urine sit for 2 weeks first in a covered barrel, the way Klaus said his grandfather had, because fresh urine was too sharp, too strong, and would scorch a seed coat rather than soften it. Aged and diluted, it turned mild, almost sweet-smelling in a strange, earthy way, and Ira dipped his hand into it more than once just to feel how different it was from what he'd expected. He poured his 110 pounds of old seed corn into 3 burlap sacks, tied them loosely so the liquid could move through the kernels, and lowered them into the tank an hour before sundown. He didn't fully understand the science, not in the way a university man might have explained it, but Klaus had tried to give him the shape of it over coffee 2 winters back, and Ira had turned the idea over enough times since that he could recite it now almost like a lesson learned by heart. Urine carries urea, and urea breaks down into compounds that a dry, dormant seed doesn't normally encounter until it's already buried in warm, wet soil. Those compounds, Klaus said, seem to trick the seed's own machinery into waking early, activating an enzyme called amylase, which exists inside every kernel of corn waiting for the right signal, whose whole job is to break stored starch down into simple sugars the sprouting embryo can use for fuel. A dry seed sitting on a shelf has no reason to spend that sugar. A seed soaking in a diluted nitrogen bath for 10 hours, Klaus claimed, gets fooled into starting the process early, so that by the time it finally goes into the ground, it isn't starting from nothing. It's already partway towards sprouting, already carrying a small reserve of usable energy that an untreated seed has to build from scratch. Whether that was exactly right or not, Ira couldn't have proven it to a soil scientist, and he didn't try to. What he could do was watch the clock. Every hour through that first night he came out to the barn with a lantern, checked the sacks, and stirred the tank gently with a hoe handle so the liquid moved evenly through the kernels rather than pooling at the bottom. At the 10-hour mark, just before dawn, he hauled the sacks out, dripping and heavy, and spread the corn across a sheet of canvas in the barn to dry for a day before planting. The kernels looked different already, plumper somehow, the wrinkles at their tips softened, though he told himself that might only be the water talking and not anything real. He kept the tin dipper close through all of it, using it now not for lime or chicken feed, but to test the tank's level, to taste check nothing, to simply have something familiar in his hand while he waited on 10 hours to pass. It had become, without his quite noticing, less a tool than a kind of company. Planting went into the ground the 2nd week of April, and within 9 days green shoots broke the surface. Across Ira's 40 acres in rows straighter and thicker than anything he'd managed the year before with dry seed. Word of that traveled faster than Ira wanted it to, the way any unusual thing does in a county where most men have little else to talk about besides each other's fields, and it reached Roscoe Sutter within the week. He didn't come out to see for himself. Instead, on a Tuesday morning in late April, a boy from the bank delivered a folded note to the Kellum mailbox informing Ira that the balance on his equipment note, the one Sutter had quietly bought up from the original lender 2 winters earlier, would need to be settled in full by the 1st of August, 3 months earlier than the terms Ira had signed. No explanation was given beyond a line about the bank's tightening position, the same phrase Sutter had used at the store back in March, though everyone in Larkspur understood by now whose hand actually moved that particular pen. Nettie read the note twice at the kitchen table and set it down without a word, and Ira sat across from her doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to. 3 months wasn't enough time to sell a crop that wouldn't even tassel until July, let alone bring in the money before an August deadline, built specifically to fall before harvest. He understood the note for what it was, not a bank being cautious, but a man trying to make sure Ira lost his land before anyone could prove the bucket in his barn had been worth anything at all. May came in dry and got drier. The whole region baked under a sky that refused rain for 11 straight days, then 11 more, and the temperature climbed past what the almanac called reasonable for the season, soil going hard and pale at the surface the way it does in a year that will later be remembered by a number rather than a name. Ira walked his rows every morning before the heat set in, watching for the wilt that was already showing up 2 farms over on Otis Pruitt's hybrid corn, seedlings curling at the edges under a sun that seemed determined to punish everyone equally. His own stand held steadier than he expected, though not without cost. He hauled water by hand to the driest corners of the field some evenings, arms aching, shirt soaked through, while Nettie kept the household accounts tighter than either of them liked to discuss out loud. By the last week of May, the equipment note sat folded in the drawer of the kitchen table like something alive, and Ira had started doing a different kind of arithmetic each night before bed, not what he owed, but how many bushels an acre it would take, at whatever price corn brought that fall, to answer a debt built to arrive 3 months too soon. Nettie's brother Warren drove up from Salina in the first week of June with a truck full of opinions he hadn't been asked for, the way he usually did when the family's fortunes looked uncertain. He walked the fence line with Ira, kicking at the dry clods between the rows, and said plainly that a man with a note coming, due in August, had no business betting the farm on a story he'd heard secondhand from a Baltic immigrant at a Grange supper. He meant it kindly, in his way. Warren had never been unkind to Ira, only relentlessly practical, but the words landed the same as unkindness does when a man is already tired. Ira didn't argue with him either. He'd stopped arguing with anyone about the seed weeks ago. He only said that the corn was standing, that standing corn in a dry May was its own kind of answer, whatever anyone chose to believe about how it got that way. Around town, the talk had softened from open mockery into something quieter and more uncertain, which was in some ways harder to bear than the laughter at the Grange Hall had been. People didn't quite believe Ira had done anything remarkable, but they'd stopped being sure he hadn't, and that uncertainty made for awkward conversations at the feed store, half compliments delivered with a shrug, as if praising Ira's corn too plainly might somehow embarrass the speaker later if the whole thing turned out to be luck. Selma Quimby, buying chicken feed one Saturday, told her husband on the drive home that she'd seen the Kellum field from the county road and it looked greener than anything else out that way, though she said it almost apologetically, unsure whether that observation was hers to make. What none of them could see, because it happened below the surface and asked for nothing but patience, was the thing actually deciding the summer. Ira's primed seed had pushed roots down faster and deeper in those first critical weeks than the fresh hybrid stock had, because the early sugar reserve Klaus had described gave each seedling a head start before it ever had to compete for water on its own. By the middle of June, while Otis Pruitt's hybrid rows were sending thin, shallow roots scrambling sideways through baked topsoil in a desperate search for moisture, Ira's corn had already anchored itself 18 inches down into soil that still held a memory of spring rain. Nobody walking past a fence could have known that. From the road, in the punishing white light of a Kansas June, one green field looked much like any other. The difference wasn't visible yet. It was only quietly becoming true. The first hint of trouble beyond Ira's own fence came in the last days of June, when the county extension agent, a careful man named Delbert Harmon, drove out to 3 different hybrid fields west of town and came away with numbers that didn't sit right with him. Emergence counts on the new hybrid stock were running well under what the seed company's own literature promised. some stands as low as 50% where 90 had been expected, and Harmon suspected the culprit wasn't the seed itself, but the ground it had gone into. Soil temperatures at planting depth had spiked unusually high that spring, well above what the hybrid variety had been bred and tested for, and a seed that germinates readily at 70 degrees can behave very differently at 90. He mentioned this, carefully and without accusation, at the next Grange meeting, the same hall where Sutter had mocked Ira back in March. Sutter didn't take it carefully at all. He stood up before Harmon had finished and said the trouble wasn't the soil, it was growers cutting corners on planting depth and bed preparation, and that any man whose stand had come in thin needed to replant now, while there was still time, with fresh hybrid seed from his own store, seed he'd extend on credit himself, he announced, because he believed in his product even if the weather had turned unkind. It was, on its surface, a generous offer, and several farmers in the room, frightened by their own bare rows, took him up on it within the week. What Sutter didn't say, because he could not have known how badly he needed the wager to pay off, was that he'd already borrowed heavily from the regional bank in Topeka to keep his shelves stocked through a season that had drained them twice over, and that every bag of seed he now extended on credit was seed he didn't yet own free and clear himself. Ira heard about the replanting push secondhand from Kenneth Quinlan at the feed scale, who mentioned it with the particular carefulness of a man trying not to take sides. Ira only nodded and went back to walking his own rows, which by late June stood taller than a man's waist and showed no sign of the wilt spreading through Otis Pruitt's replanted acres 2 farms over. He'd stopped needing anyone else's account of things by then. He could see his corn for himself every morning, dark green and thick-stalked, drinking from roots that had gone looking for water while the ground was still cool enough to make the search worth something. What Ira couldn't see yet, because it was happening in a bank office 2 counties away, and in the private arithmetic Roscoe Sutter did each night behind his ledger, was how much of himself Sutter had staked on a bet against the very possibility that an old man's soaking trick from the Baltic coast might turn out to be worth something after all. July arrived without mercy. The heat that had merely threatened in May and June settled in for good, day after day past 100 degrees, and the replanted hybrid fields around Larkspur began to fail in earnest, their shallow roots unable to reach whatever moisture remained below the baked crust of topsoil. Ira's corn suffered too. No field escapes a Kansas drought entirely, but it suffered from a higher starting point, its deeper roots buying it weeks that the neighboring stands simply didn't have. Quincy Quaid, who'd worked beside Ira since they were boys, and had hauled water with him more evenings than either could count that summer, said one night, wiping his face with his sleeve, that he didn't see how any of it would matter if the note came due before there was a single ear of corn ready to sell. He wasn't wrong to worry. The equipment note in the kitchen drawer read August the 1st, plain as anything, and July's corn, however healthy, was still corn on the stalk, not corn in the bin, and a bank draft doesn't care how green a field looks from the road. The 1st of August came on a Saturday, dry and merciless as every day before it. Ira drove into town that morning with Nettie beside him, both of them dressed as though for church, though it wasn't Sunday, carrying between them exactly enough, cash to cover perhaps a third of what the note demanded, money scraped together from selling 2 hogs, and a mowing machine neither of them could really spare. He didn't expect it to be enough, and it wasn't. Sutter received them in the back office of the feed store with the same unhurried courtesy he'd shown back in March, glanced at the sum Ira laid on the desk, and said, not unkindly, that partial payment on a note this size changed nothing about what the terms required. He said the bank, meaning, as everyone understood, himself, would need to begin foreclosure proceedings on the equipment and, if necessary, the land it secured within the week. Ira walked out of that office feeling something he hadn't let himself feel in months, a kind of hollow, bottomed-out fear that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the simple, ordinary terror of losing the ground his father had farmed before him. Standing corn taller than any in the county wouldn't matter if it wasn't his to harvest come October. Quincy Quaid drove out that same evening, having heard the news from Kenneth Quinlan before Ira had even made it home, and the two men sat on the porch steps without much to say to each other for a long while. Quincy finally said what he'd clearly been carrying the whole drive over, that he'd stand behind Ira however he could, offer his own small savings if it would help, though both of them knew a hired hand's savings wouldn't dent a debt that size. It wasn't the offer itself that mattered so much as the fact of it. One more person willing to stand in the dark with him, rather than at a safe distance, and Ira told him so plainly, before Quincy drove back to his own place under a sky gone hard and starless with the drought. That night he sat on the back porch long after Nettie had gone to bed, the tin dipper turning over and over in his hands out of pure habit, and for the first time since the bucket had first gone into the barn in March, he let himself wonder whether all of it, the soaking, the 10 hours, the quiet certainty he'd carried through a summer of ridicule, had simply been a beautiful, stubborn way of losing everything a little more slowly. He thought of his father, who'd used this same dipper for lime and chicken feed, and nothing more remarkable than that, and wondered what the old man would have made of watching his son bet the farm on 10 hours in a bucket. Somewhere past midnight, with no answer arriving and no comfort in sight, Ira went into bed anyway, because morning would come regardless of what he decided to believe about it. Delbert Harmon's second report reached the county Grange board on the second Tuesday of August, and this time nobody laughed at anything in it. Harmon had spent the last 3 weeks walking fields across Ellsworth County, with a notebook and a soil thermometer, and the numbers he laid before the board painted a picture no one could argue with, because it was written in the corn itself. Hybrid stands planted and replanted through the abnormal heat of that spring were averaging emergence, and yield figures the worst the county had recorded in 5 years, thin ears, shallow kernels, whole rows abandoned as not worth the fuel to harvest. Ira Kellum's 40 acres, planted with 4-year-old seed, that had been soaked for 10 hours in diluted cattle urine before it ever went into the ground, were testing at 89% germination, and stood to bring in the best yield per acre. Harmon had measured anywhere in the county that year. He said plainly, in front of the same men who'd sat in that hall back in March, that he couldn't fully explain the mechanism, but that something in the soaking process appeared to have given Ira's seed a head start the hybrid stock never got, a reserve of energy drawn from the seed's own starch, activated early enough to build the deep root system that had let his corn outlast a drought that broke almost everything else in the township. Ira sat in the same back row he'd occupied in March, and this time no one laughed. Kenneth Quinlan, from his seat near the front, turned around and gave him a nod that needed no words attached to it. Selma Quimby leaned over to her husband and said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, that she'd told him back in June the Kellum field looked different, though nobody minded the small exaggeration of memory that came with saying so, now that it had been proven true. Otis Pruitt, whose own replanted hybrid acres lay half abandoned 2 farms over, caught Ira's eye across the hall and offered something that wasn't quite an apology but stood in for one. A long look, a slow nod, an acknowledgement passed silently between 2 men who both understood. There was nothing left to say about it that the fields hadn't already said better. Roscoe Sutter wasn't in the room to hear it. He'd left for Topeka 2 days earlier, summoned by the regional bank that had extended him the credit to stock his replanting push. And what happened in that meeting Larkspur only learned in pieces over the following week, that the bank, seeing county-wide hybrid failure crater the value of the seed and equipment debt Sutter had personally guaranteed, called in the full balance of his own note on the spot, with no 3-month grace period, no quiet warning delivered by a boy on a bicycle. He had, in trying to make sure Ira lost everything before harvest, borrowed himself into a hole no ordinary season could have filled, and the same abnormal heat that spared Ira's deep-rooted corn had ruined the collateral Sutter needed to survive. Back in Larkspur, with Sutter gone and Harmon's report now the talk of every feed store and kitchen table in the county, the equipment note itself found its way out of danger through much plainer means. Ambrose Teague, who ran the implement dealership and had sold Ira's father his first tractor 20 years before, drove out to see the Kellum field for himself, walked 2 rows deep into standing corn taller than his own head, and offered on the spot to buy the note outright from whatever remained of Sutter's tangled affairs and carry it himself until October, when the corn would be in the bin and the debt could be settled the ordinary way, with money instead of desperation. Ira shook his hand in the middle of the field, the tin dipper still in his shirt pocket where it had ridden all summer, and for the first time since March, he let himself believe the worst of it was over. Kenneth Quinlan brought the last of the Sutter news out to the co-op scale himself, the way he'd once brought Ira's grain tickets, though this time he lowered his voice as he told it, the way people do when a man's ruin has stopped being satisfying and started being simply sad. Sutter's store had closed for good in September, its shelves auctioned to settle what remained of the Topeka debt, and the last anyone in Larkspur had seen of him was a single crate of unsold ledgers loaded into the back of a borrowed truck. No crowd to watch him go, no one troubling to remember exactly which direction he'd driven off in. Nobody in town felt much like celebrating it. There was only, Kenneth said, a kind of quiet where the store used to be, the front window empty, the sign not yet taken down. Years later, on a September afternoon in 1958, Ira's grandson Wendell stood in that same barn, 12 years old and impatient, holding a chipped tin dipper his grandfather had pressed into his hands that morning, without much explanation. Ira, 70 now and slower than he used to be, showed the boy how to measure the mixture in the stock tank, 10 parts water to 1 part aged manure tea, the ratio close enough to what a German farmer had once described over coffee that it hardly mattered anymore where the numbers had originally come from. Wendell asked why they still bothered when the seed catalog in the house offered treated hybrid corn that germinated at 95% straight out of the bag, no soaking required, no waiting through the night. Ira considered the question longer than the boy expected. He said that the seed in the catalog was probably fine, and that a man ought to use whatever tool served him best in a given year, but that there was something worth keeping in knowing how to make an old, unwanted thing worth something again, in case the year ever came when that was the only kind of seed a man had left. Wendell didn't fully understand what he meant, not yet, but he nodded anyway, and dipped his hand into the tank the way his grandfather showed him, feeling the strange mild warmth of the liquid against his fingers for the first time. The tin dipper stayed in that barn long after the stock tank was gone, hung on a nail by the door where anyone passing could see it, not because Ira ever made a ceremony of it, but because it had simply never occurred to him to throw it away. Some tools earn their place that way, not through any single dramatic use, but through years of being reached for, again and again, by hands that trusted them. On the nail it hung a little crooked, dented at the rim, the wooden handle darker now than it had been even in his father's day, and it would stay there, plain and unremarked upon, for as long as there were Kellums left to farm that ground. Wendell hung the dipper back on its nail before they walked up to the house for supper, and Ira let him do it without correction, the boy's small hands finding the exact same worn groove his own father's hands had once found, and his grandfather's before that. Neither of them spoke of Roscoe Sutter that afternoon, or of the Grange Hall, or of a summer 22 years gone that neither of them needed to explain out loud anymore. The barn door stood open behind them, the evening light falling in long gold bars across the empty stock tank, and somewhere out past the fence line the corn kept doing, quietly, what it had always done, reaching down for whatever water the ground still held, patient enough to wait out whatever the sky decided to send that year.